this need to be Indian is a very American phenomenon. When it comes down to the disavowal of whiteness, the disavowal of settlerness, the need to distance oneself from America's genocidal history, to not
Mm.
be associated with that. Well, my family, I'm Native too. I'm not complicit. My family didn't do that.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. I'm here with Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Dina is from the Colville Confederated Tribes. She's a lecturer in American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and she's a consultant and educator in environmental justice policy planning. She teaches courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians and sports, and decolonization. Dina has done a lot of writing as well. She's an award-winning journalist, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, Los Angeles Times, High Country News, many others. She's a co-author with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz of All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. Her second book was called As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And her newest book, which just came out a couple months ago, is called Who Gets to Be Indian? Ethnic Fraud, Disenrollment, and Other Difficult Conversations About Native American Identity. She's also part of CELDF's Partner Advisor Committee, so we've met and had a number of conversations before this. So, Dina, I'm really glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be in conversation with you.
So I want to open it up in case you want to add anything about who you are and your background, where you come from. But I also want to ask you about your second book, rather, Dina, As Long as Grass Grows.
Mhm.
Why did you write that book, and how did your background lead you to wanting to get into that topic?
Yeah, well, I'll just fill in terms of my current roles. I'm also have taken on a new position here on campus at Cal State San Marcos as the assistant director of the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center. And so it's a research center that is in conjunction with the American Indian Studies Department. So I'm really, and that's just, I just started here doing that in that role this fall. So I've been here on campus for, oh gosh, I don't know, about 8 years, I guess, teaching. And so this just deepens my role on campus with the center and with the students and all of our research projects. So super excited about that. In terms of the book, As Long as Grass Grows, how that book started was a result of my student days. And so I was a student. I was an older non-traditional student at the University of New Mexico like 20 years ago, and in Native American Studies. And I was, in my 40s at that point, and um, gone gone back to school. Was really clear about what I was studying, but I had also come out of like a history of activism at that point. So I was living in had been living in Northern California and got involved in Native rights issues, and environmental issues. So I considered myself an environmentalist. And so when I went back to school, I was really focused on, within the context of Native American studies, I was very interested in environmental stuff, how tribes engage issues of environment and land. And so I had was just everything I was studying seemed to revolve around that, and that continued on into my grad program, which was in American Studies on the same campus. And I was particularly taken by this topic of environmental justice. I was been unfamiliar with it. I had taken a course in the American Indian Studies program on environmental justice, which was really just an evolving topic at that point. And I and it was obvious to me that there was very little information or scholarship that was written by Native people on this, explicit topic, environmental justice. And by the time I had gotten to a grad program and was studying about it and had taken a course on it, there was no focus on Native American issues at all, even in New Mexico. So we read no Native authors and read no scholarship on Indigenous issues. So it was obvious to me that there was a real big, gap in the literature, and so that's what prompted me to write a master's thesis on it, like to I did a case study on an issue that took place in Southern California, which is where I live now, in a beach community that involved saving a Native American sacred site in a place that had a very complex jurisdiction, involving a non-federally recognized tribe, and so it was a very, very rich site to study and to evolve a theoretical foundation for what environmental justice means for Native American people, which I contend is very different than for all other environmental justice communities as the language is used. And so that's how it all started. And it started as a master's thesis. And after I got out of grad school, uh, the opportunity arose with my publisher, Beacon Press, who had asked me about environmental justice. They knew I had, and this is right around the time of Standing Rock. So Standing Rock conflict was happening in 2016. I had gone there as a journalist, and my publishers at Beacon Press, asked me about it. They knew I had written this master's thesis, and so I was basically conscripted to write the book, and that's how it all came about. So it was fortunate. I've always been fortunate as an author because I had formed this relationship with Beacon Press, which is an amazing press. People are they would love to be published there, and I was invited directly in. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay. And so in the book, I believe you tell the story of that location on the beach that you mentioned that you focused on in your master's research in some detail. You give a lot of different case studies from looking at Standing Rock to uranium mining around Navajo country, lots of different case studies of environmental justice affecting environmental injustice and environmental destruction, pollution, toxicity, land destruction affecting indigenous communities. Um, and you also do, like you just said, you're kind of drawing out this difference between the traditional environmental justice communities, what most of the literature looked at the time, which from my limited understanding, I'm sure you know far more about this than I do, but most of the research was focused on more urban communities, often Black communities or Latino communities, low-income communities that were facing often pollution, intergenerational legacies of polluting heavy industries being sited in or adjacent to these communities, and so them facing disproportionate impacts to their health and so on. Um, but you write about how there's a very different and distinct history for Native people that influences uh, the conception of what environmental justice is for Native people, and what that means. Could you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's about it's the starting place is that what makes Native American communities different is the fact that they are nations with political relationships to the state, the U.S. state, and also local and state governments. And so that's the starting place. Native people are not ethnic minority communities, and they have very, very different relationships to land and place, and these and very different histories inside the United States because of this political relationship to the state, and so that's the starting place. And once all of that is taken as context, then it creates a very different conversation about what environmental justice and injustice looks like. So in the book, I talk about there's a chapter on genocide, for
Mhm,
example, and having to look at the U.S.'s history of genocide and some of the techniques that were used were directly connected to land and to
mm,
creating conditions that were designed to eliminate native existence on the land, including,
mm,
starvation, including land dispossession, and other kinds of impacts. And so these are all of that has to be taken into consideration. If we talk about environmental injustice, the way the literature has, conventionally framed it is that it's about more even distribution of risk and harm
mm,
into communities because environmental racism, this is the framework that is typically used. Environmental injustice is due to environmental racism, and that is true for many communities that are targets of environmental injustice. But for Native people, it's beyond racism. So,
mhm,
because it involves issues of sovereignty and land and
mm,
politics and nationhood. So all of that makes for a very, very different kind of framing and conversation, which has to be explicitly acknowledged.
mm. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I was doing some reading last night. This Trinidadian historian who was writing about slavery, and he was writing about how a lot of people have the conception that racism created slavery, or racism led to slavery for descendants of African slaves. And he was flipping that around, and he was saying, no, actually the slavery came first. There was xenophobia, there was, discrimination and prejudice and so on, but it wasn't codified yet into the system of racism as, a social construct to sort of flatten and describe and put people into these boxes. So it's interesting to hear you say that, because it seems like there's some parallels in that um, in that settler colonialism, land theft, resource exploitation is sort of this through line in the book that underlies all of these processes of environmental injustice that you're describing, right?
Right. No, that's exactly right. And the entire project of settler colonialism has very little to do with race, and because race really wasn't like a operating mechanism, in the 15th century, right? And it was just beginning the concept of race. In fact, I go into this in the new book on in Who Gets to Be Indian. There's a real breakdown of that because Native people have been swept into the these conversations about race and discrimination, which is not untrue. It's not that racism doesn't exist for Native people, but the understanding or presumption that colonization and injustice to Native Americans was because of race, and it wasn't. So that means we have to dig down to the roots of racism as we understand it today, and that exposes a lot of things. And what the way that I write about it in this new book is, having to go back and see, like, well, we have to look at the foundations of colonialism, with the voyages of Europeans here and what that was all about, what was the driving logics of that, and that takes us to the doctrine of discovery, which, of course, the doctrine of discovery is the foundation of federal Indian law now, which maintains this relationship of hegemony and domination, or the doctrine of, some have called it the doctrine of domination, and that's not entirely inaccurate. But when we go back to that time, to the 15th century, this is when the concept of race was just germinating. And it goes back to, if you the line of scholarship that I follow is takes us back to Spain and the time of the Inquisition, and this is during the time, the beginning of the Costa system in Spain, is about how the Spanish were discriminating against the Jews, and the concept of racial purity comes out is not so much about race, but as about the purity of religion. So it's
Mm,
not about, like, it is about blood purity and the mixing of different ethnicities together, but it's not based on the ethnicity itself as it is about the religion.
mm,
So the purity of blood, and I invite readers or listeners to. I really love the way that it's broken down. There's a film series called "Exterminate All the Brutes." It's on
mm,
HBO Max, and that was a Ralph Peck film series, a docu-series, 4 parts, and they get really into these definitions there, so it makes it really easy to understand. But yes, it's about the mixing of blood but framed as religion.
mm,
And so, the logic in the United States, the way it was imported here was, and the origins of the relationships between Europeans and Indians and the hatred was based on the fact that Native people weren't Christians. They were
mm,
savages, right? It wasn't that they were racially different, even though there was a recognition of that, but they were dehumanized because they weren't Christians.
mm.
And so it's that dehumanization that creates the conditions for the genocide that then is unleashed for the next 400 years.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
the way that we think about race in this country and, well, and globally, really, is still evolving. And I'm glad to hear that what you said about this Trinidadian scholar who is thinking critically through it around slavery, because I think he's on the right track about that.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. Eric Williams is his name, and it is a nice connection point between your two books because it sort of gets to this issue of the relationship between power and identity, the in-group, the out-group. How do you construct the other in order often to justify the uh, uh, the ongoing nature, continuation of, and expansion of exploitation or violence that some often has already been in progress. And I'm thinking about, um, like you just said, Dina, about sort of the changing nature of race over time, which of course points to the reality that it's a social creation that doesn't have a clear
Yeah.
scientific basis, as many people have said over decades and centuries. I'm thinking about the book How the Irish Became White, for
Mm.
example, which
Um,
it sounds like you know, which
uh-huh.
for listeners talks about how in the early colonial period of the United States, many of the Irish settler colonists who were coming over to the United States, many of whom were fleeing English repression and violence, colonization of their homeland, were were not treated or considered as white in the United States. And so, despite the fact that they had light skin and by physical appearance were European and looked very much like the Englishmen and the Danes and all the other Europeans who were coming over at the time, um, they weren't considered a part of the group white, which was this sort of caste, this socially constructed class of people that had certain privileges and rights
Which was already
in
present in
society,
Europe
right?
at the time as well too,
Mhm.
right? Like, if we follow Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's, line of reasoning, settler colonialism, the beginning of it has its roots in, the English domination against the Irish, on those lands. So, these are people who look the same effectively, but
Mhm.
they were still constructed as others. So it's the
Mhm.
othering of people who are considered enemies that is the foundation for the justification for violence and land
Mm.
theft. And
Yeah,
so
and of
take
course,
all these different you know, expressions, depending on where you're at.
mm. So maybe you can help us make that connection more explicitly between this conversation that we're having and the focus of your new book, Who Gets to Be Indian? Because I haven't read this book yet, full disclosure. Um, I'm familiar with some of the topics. I've, read articles over the years on this and, watched the film, uh, what's it called? White Shamans and Plastic Medicine Men, which has some overlap with the topics that you're covering here. I've read some of your writing, listened to other interviews that you've done on this topic, talking about Sasheen Littlefeather and sort of how you got pulled into writing about this topic. Could you dive into that? Like, what led you from your last book to this new one, and what do you think is sort of the through line between the topics of environmental justice and genocide um, that you were covering previously and this topic?
Yeah, they're actually I know it doesn't seem obvious on the surface, but I draw those through lines in this new book to environmental issues. So I grew up in Southern California, the first generation of Native people who are impacted by federal relocation policy. And so this happens during the 1950s. My mother was from Washington, had spent much of her life on the reservation, but this is during the 1950s. Of course, this termination policy of the federal government is designed to as the final solution for the Indian problem, and they're moving people off the reservations under the guise of a jobs program.
Mm,
Um, so there's this mass migration of Native people, like 100,000 people. Native people are moved off of reservations into cities under this, jobs program. My mother didn't come to Los Angeles on a jobs program, but she came during that era of this mass migration that has resulted in this massive demographic shift of Native people coming from reservations into, leaving reservations to these urban environments, often out of state. So my mother comes to Los Angeles, meets my dad. My dad is 100% Sicilian immigrant, but American born. I also wanted to say, like, the construction of whiteness that you
right.
described about the Irish happened with the Italians as well and
Uh-huh.
other racial groups. So Italians were also perceived as not white, suffered a lot of discrimination as a result of it, and constructed themselves as white in much the same way that the Irish did over time.
Right.
So anyway, my parents meet. I am a product of that relationship. I'm very ethnically mixed. I'm Native American. My mother was an enrolled tribal member, but I am not, because I can't meet the blood quantum standards.
Huh.
But I'm still, we still maintain relations with our family there, although they were diminishing. So but I had always very much identified with my mom's native culture more than dad's Sicilian American culture. So it was just natural that I would, as I grew up, I just gravitated towards that. So I'm a baby boomer, right? I was born at the end of the baby boom generation, and I was living in the Bay Area, up in the North County of the Bay Area in Sonoma County, and as I was growing, like coming into my adulthood, connecting with other Native people, I saw this burgeoning New Age movement, and I was really in the middle of it. And it's really about the
Huh.
counterculture. The counterculture evolves into the New Age movement. And the counterculture, of course, is all wrapped up with the Back to the Land movement. It's all, which is very much tied into Indian country. The hippies were going back to the reservations, and I write about that in the book, As Long as Grass Grows. The counterculture, the environmental movement, becomes all tied up with cultural appropriation, for well-intended reasons, but very misguided. And I was present for all of that. I saw all of that, and got involved in it, and not really fully comprehending what was happening. But oddly enough, it was this time for a lot of displaced Native people like me. It was a place and a time where the connecting of these two things opened doors to culture for people
Right.
like me. And so it was paradoxical, but I lived that. Um, in the new book, so that's like kind of context, like,
Mhm.
thumbnail context for who I am. Um, then I get into Native American studies, and I, start to see, I start becoming really aware of, who is who and who is saying what. And now I'm in academia, and seeing the proliferation of people with claims to Native identities, but having no actual connections to Native cultures, and this phenomenon of, plastic shamanism, all these terms that have been applied to it, wannabeism, cultural appropriation, and now pretendianism, has only expanded and become like a kind of a crisis in Indian country. And we see it especially in academia, the infiltration of people with unsubstantiated claims to nativeness, taking
Hmm.
jobs, taking financial resources, grants, and positions and fellowships, and all these kinds of things that are meant for actual Native people. So there's this whole all of this is tied up. It's not just academia, it's also the entertainment industry. As I write about in the book, pretendingism as we know it today traces back to the beginning of the film industry.
Huh.
So over a century, we've been dealing with this. And then it's the entertainment industry, it's academia, and it's publishing, and also government contracting, where we see this phenomenon really entrenched. But I had the reason that the book came about was because I had known Sasheen Littlefeather. I had encountered her starting in 2012, when I was asked to write an article about her for Indian Country Today. And it was that experience of meeting her and her asking me if I would be willing to ghostwrite her memoir with her.
mm,
So I agreed to do that. We started working on this book project, and at the beginning of that process, she pulled the plug. Didn't want to. She changed her mind. Didn't bother giving me any kind of explanation why. And so she just sort of basically ghosted me. And there was a 5-minute phone call saying that she wanted to change her direction and didn't say
mm,
why. And so I never
mm,
really understood. But in the process, she had given me a journal, and she had 200 pages of this handwritten journal that she had kept over a period of 4 or 5 years, and so had given me the photocopied pages of this journal, and didn't ask for it back, and so I had this thing in my possession for all those years, and then when she passed away in 2022, it came out that because of this article that was written in the San Francisco Chronicle, that she was a fraud, and it was written by Jackie Keeler, and this thing was a bombshell. It set Indian country on fire. People didn't want to hear it, although there were other people who secretly suspected it was true. So it was
mm,
at this point that I decided to come out and say what I knew. So I wrote an article on the follow-up of Jackie's article, and then I knew that it was time for me to think about, this evidence, this journal that I had in my possession, and to use this as a case study for how pretendingism, how somebody could so blatantly uh, ride this wave of ethnic fraud like she did for almost 50 years, so like a half a century. She
mhm,
perpetuated a fraud. She completely hoodwinked and gaslighted people for all these years, and people were so resistant to hear that she was a liar.
mhm,
She convinced so many people, and it's still the case. There are still people. I think people have, it's been 3 years now, and people are more. They've sort of adjusted to it, but there's still a lot of people out there who don't want to believe it.
mhm,
So my experience with her and this journal became the foundation for like the case study, for like as a jumping off point, like how we can talk about ethnic fraud and what are the constituent, elements of it. How did it start? And so the book does the point of the book is to do an analysis, to provide an analysis. My argument is that we have to get beyond call out culture, because the way that we have these conversations, they're academics having conversations who are writing scholarship on it, and that's great. Um, but what we don't really have was a historical trajectory. Like, I wanted to know, like, how did we get there? How did this start? Why do people, when we understand cultural appropriation and like Phil Deloria's classic book Playing Indian, he really
mm,
laid that groundwork for us. And so, but it's so much beyond cultural appropriation that
right.
we need to understand what the processes are that started, why people culturally appropriate, and why at some point playing Indian turns into becoming Indian
Mm,
in the 20th century. And so that's like the kind of the framework that
mm.
I take on in the book.
Okay, interesting. I'm having a couple thoughts. One is about how, as you're well aware, and probably most of the readers are, I'm thinking about how the U.S. military, for example, has adopted various various tribal nations names for military hardware, right? Apache helicopters and things along this lines. There is sort of this uh, 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 in the wake of genocide, of the U.S. military actively committing genocide in a series of military campaigns, over a couple centuries, there's this sort of post-conflict appropriation of they would probably say the honored enemy, but it's really it's this sort of like spitting on the opponent, right? I'm thinking about that. That's coming to mind. Um, I'm thinking about the the old phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man," which came out of the boarding schools, right? And this sort of whole idea of, as you were talking about earlier, Christianizing indigenous peoples, forcing them to stop speaking their traditional languages, engaging in their traditional practices and food ways and relationships with each other and governance systems and so on. I'm thinking about this sort of colonization of identity, so to speak. This, and maybe there's some sort of strange parallel there to something that we're seeing across the culture as a whole, in terms of, in this in this AI digitized smartphone apps, mass surveillance era that we live in. Capitalism is more broadly kind of colonizing people's minds. I don't know if that's the right term, but like, I'm thinking about dating apps, for example, and now people's love lives are being monetized and tracked and sort of dissected by
Everything's
these.
everything's commodified, and that's one of the
Right.
things that the one of the arguments, the theoretical foundation of the book is that, settler colonial so the twin processes of settler colonialism and capitalism, combined together, to create the problem that we have now. Native identity became commodified, and that happened in the film industry.
Mm,
So nativeness becomes a commodity that can be bought and sold on the open market.
mhm,
And so you're exactly right. You're on, right on track with that. Um, and so, but it's also about settler colonialism as the framework. We talk about it being it's about the elimination of the native in order to replace.
mhm,
And so settlers come for the land, and the native population has to be eliminated so that the settler population can replace them. And so when identity is conscribed to the realm of uh, something that you own, right? If it's about, I can say it's tied up with First Amendment logics of freedom of speech and
right,
property rights. So identity, and that's how we think about it in the United States. Identity, I can say I am who I am, because I have the right to say it, and it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's that I have the right to say it, and that then becomes unassailable.
mhm,
And it's especially true with nativeness. And so, so when identity, which is commodified, is confined to the realm of property rights and free speech, and it's a personal possession, then and then you combine that with capitalism, then
mhm,
it's then and settler colonialism's need to replace the indigenous population. Identity is the last thing they can take,
mhm,
as Kim Tallbear argues.
mm,
Uh, it's the last frontier, she says, of settler colonial theft.
mm,
And that's the through line. In terms of, going back to your question about the connection between the environmental issues, environmental justice, and identity, um, when people can assume the identity of being native and not be subject to question of it, then then it's a free-for-all, and what the way it's played out is, we have hundreds of groups now that assert themselves as tribes,
Mm,
uh, fraudulently, although some of them that are non-federally recognized tribes are legitimate, right? They're
mm,
legitimate tribes, and that's really especially true here in California because of the way colonialism played out.
mm,
But, uh, it nationally, you have the Cherokee Nation found in 2007, they did a study, and that's almost 20 years ago now. They found that there were, at that time, over 200 groups claimed to be Cherokee tribes
mm,
fraudulently. That was that. And it's only grown since then. In California, we have, and not just in California, but so it's here in California, but also in the Northeast, you see this phenomenon as well. And over there, they call them pop-up tribes. So these are
mm,
groups that are coming out of the woodwork claiming to be Wampanoag, claiming to be Lenapes and Abenakis, and that's especially that's one that's specially loaded. The state of Vermont has four tribes that are state recognized tribes, and this is a whole other conversation about state recognition versus federal
mm,
recognition. Some states have a process that recognizes tribes that are not federally recognized, but those processes are notoriously unrigorous
mm,
compared to the federal process. There's a federal process to gain federal recognition. um, States do not exercise the same kind of rigor that the U.S. does. And so in the case of Vermont, for example, there are four groups that claim to be Abenaki tribes. But they have not, so the Daryl LaRoe's research shows that none of them have ever had to prove genealogical ties
mm,
to any Abenaki communities. And
mm,
so and that would be true in other contexts as well. And here
mm,
in California, we have, uh, I don't even know how many. There are so many of these pop-up tribes, they keep popping up, like, almost every day it seems like there's some new group coming out claiming to be some tribe.
mm,
And there's always a reason why they say that they weren't able to gain federal recognition or to be enrolled in other tribes that they claim. But what's happened is that they, in the conservation world, in the environmental world, they are vying for dollars, like money,
mm,
to start programs based on, and projects based on their assertions of tribal identities. And here's an example that I write about in the book. In California, there was a marine sanctuary that was recently passed just in the last year by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric uh,
administration.
Administration. Thank you.
Mm,
So NOAA created this marine sanctuary off the coast of San Luis Obispo, and it was started by a group. So it's called the Chumash Marine Heritage Site, and it was started by a group of people in 2015 who claimed to be the Northern Chumash Tribal Council.
mm,
And so they were passing themselves off as a tribal council, but all they really were, it was a family with a cultural monitoring firm
mm,
organized as a nonprofit,
mm,
claiming to be Chumash. There was a lawsuit. I won't get into the details of that, but there was a lawsuit about that issue, about the fact that a genealogical study showed that the person who started that project, Fred Collins, who claimed to be Chumash, they showed through this lawsuit that he could end this genealogy, that he had absolutely no Chumash heritage whatsoever. It wasn't that they couldn't find any Chumash heritage, it's that there was none.
Uh,
Okay, and they showed all of his ancestors. Of all of his ancestors, none of them were Chumash. So he dies. His daughter takes over. She has no Chumash heritage, but they, over years of this project, it gets so much attention, all the way to the highest levels of the federal government, including the White House, including Deb Haaland, who was the Secretary of the Interior, including um, uh, elected native elected Congress people. They all jumped on this project. Meanwhile, there's an actual tribe that are Northern Chumash people. They're not federally recognized, but
right.
they have the genealogy. They have their historical records all in place. They are the actual legitimate Northern Chumash tribe. For years, they came out and said that this other group, this Northern Chumash Tribal Council, is fraudulent. They are fakes. They are using our name, and no one wanted to hear it.
Uh,
And yet they became the media darlings, and the daughter of Fred Collins, Violet Sage Walker, to this day is a media darling. And I heard just the other day that she was named on Time's top 100 most influential people, that list that Time does. And it's all based on false pretenses of her being Chumash. And so it's so egregious. And now this group is actually trying to buy a piece of land in the region, a $62 million acre ranch, $62 million, 219 acre ranch,
mm,
upon which there are two Chumash villages. This group is trying to buy this land based on their unsubstantiated claims to Chumash identity. And so the actual Northern Chumash tribe, which is called the Yaktichu Tichu Yaktalimi people, they are in this position again of having to raise the alarm bells that these people are trying to buy land in the name of being us, and they're not us. So again, it's about like who has the power to control narratives, who gets the resources to create these kinds of projects and to control the narratives.
uh,
Uh, these are uh, these are so land. These are It's always about land battles, right? And
mhm.
the competition for resources. So it's not an insignificant problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, it seems to me like uh, uh, those, like the federal government proponents of major industrial projects, on traditional indigenous lands, which is all the lands. Um, these people are probably very happy that these conflicts are happening, regardless of whether or not they have any sort of involvement with them. There's sort of this sense in which this destabilization of indigenous identity, this turning of who is native and who is not itself into a contested battleground, um, it furthers the settler colonial project in a way because it it creates conditions in which Native people's political power is weakened, people's ability to access jobs, to access scholarships, to access grant funding, to access these different things is cast into question or is diluted among people who may not actually have the best interests of actual indigenous communities, nations, and people at heart. Um, so it seems like it's something that sort of plays into that ongoing process of colonization, although that may not at first glance be apparent to people. I'm reminded in some ways of like what happened with Rachel Dolezal up in Spokane, Washington, who was if listeners may not remember, she was the head of the local chapter of the NAACP, and it came out she actually wasn't Black. She wasn't African American. She had been perpetuating an ethnic fraud herself for decades, to the point that she led the local NAACP chapter. All the community members of different groups, all her friends, people who were around her, considered her to be a Black woman who was a civil rights leader in the community and was speaking on these issues, representing herself as an expert on these issues, and it was just a complete fabrication.
Yeah, it was really shocking, and it was so, uh, I mean, I think it was shocking for one reason because, it's pretty hard to pass yourself off racially as something that you're not when it comes to blackness, right? Because of skin color and, like the obvious, surface level stuff. For Native people, it's been going on forever, right? The co-opting of nativeness, um, is something that has been going on since, like, the Boston Tea Party.
Mm,
When the Boston Tea Party, when people dressed up as Indians and dumped all that tea into it, which, starts the revolution. So it's so normalized. The taking of native identity is so normalized in, the American landscape that there's no sense of shock
mm,
when it happens,
mm,
in these very egregious ways. So, uh, I mean, it's so common that people, the stories, the family lore stories that people have in their own families is often enough to just run with it, like grandpa's deathbed confession that his grandmother was half Indian or whatever.
mm,
Like, there's so many variations on
mm,
on these stories, that people and I can't tell you how many times I've heard it in my life, hundreds of times, and all Native people have heard these stories about how, "Yeah, I'm Cherokee," and,
mm,
there is these family stories passed down, and people do not even I even heard people say that to me that have taken DNA tests that
mm,
have come back with no Native DNA, and yet the story is so adhered to, they can't let it go. Like, this need to be Indian is a very American phenomenon. This need,
mm,
and there's really this need to, like, there's a whole analysis about, like, what is that? The need to, and it comes down to the disavowal of, whiteness, the disavowal of settlerness, the need to distance oneself from America's genocidal history, to not
mm,
be associated with that. Well, my family, I'm Native too. I'm not complicit. My family didn't do that. So there's a lot of ways that we can talk about this, but such a beguiling problem that it requires us to have these very deep, very dense, conversations about it and an analysis,
mm.
because it's just so normalized.
Absolutely. And Dina, I know you have to go because you have another meeting coming up here. We could go for a lot longer. This is really dense and fascinating stuff. I feel like I could go for another hour easy.
Read the
Um,
book. I think
yeah,
maybe we could have
absolutely.
another conversation about it.
Yeah, but I wanted to thank you again. Where can people find your work, get connected, get copies of your books, and follow what you're doing?
Yeah, the books can be obtained anywhere books are sold. So, I recommend going through Beacon Press's website, and any other places where books are sold typically. I don't have a big media presence. I've really been working on letting go of social media and limiting my work there. It's better for my mental health to be not too tied up into, social media, but I can be found if anybody needs to, contact me. I am on Facebook, but I don't do anything on Instagram, and I'm not on X or anything like that, but, I'm easy to find.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate all your writing, and it was great to talk to you. I'll be seeing you in a few days at a meeting we have coming up. But we'll get this out. We'll put the links to buy your books in the show notes. And thank you you again, Dina. Really
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Thanks, Max. It's great chatting with you.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.